Hello, I'm Kolan Morelock, author of Taking the Town, Collegiate and Community Culture in the Bluegrass, 1880 to 1917. This book began with a small ambition and developed into a larger one. I really wanted to write a somewhat detailed history of the 19th century, early 20th century student groups that dominated this campus across town at Transylvania University. In the end, the book became an account of intellectual and cultural history as it played out here in the Bluegrass between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of America's military involvement in the First World War. I became interested in the student literary societies, the collegiate literary societies, in graduate school. These groups were, in the 19th century, student-controlled extracurricular organizations that dominated the campuses across America. They were, in fact, the extracurriculum throughout the 19th century, before fraternities, before sports, before all those small student organizations that developed later. Like here at UK now, I see in the catalog there are over 250 different student groups. Back in the 19th century, the literary societies were the extracurriculum, and this was true up until the turn of the century and a little bit beyond in many places. They began in the antebellum colleges, some say as a revolt against the austere conditions in the colleges and the strict curriculum. They contributed, they really had a lot of intellectual and cultural pretension and aspirations, and they, through reading and writing and speaking in the form of debate and oratory and declamations, they, in their meeting rooms, they practiced these things. They were very sincere collegiate students. By doing so, they really contributed to the intellectual atmosphere of the colleges. They contributed to the development of academic libraries. These were generally young gentlemen who came from better circumstances. They were used to having libraries at home in their private homes, and they came to the colleges, especially in the antebellum area, and found there wasn't much of a library, and they developed their own. These young men had some money, and they developed their own libraries in their meeting rooms. These libraries eventually, in many cases, evolved into the academic libraries of the institutions as we know them today. Joe Tanner was an educated man. He cared about the life of the mind. He was a product of the 19th century literary societies. He had been a literary society member here at Transylvania when he was in undergraduate school before he transferred to finish at Princeton. He struggled as an attorney. He went into political life, but in those days, if you had not been in the Confederate Army, it was difficult. You know, they say that one author said that Kentucky waited till after the Civil War to secede, and in the Gilded Age area, the lost cause was enshrined in Kentucky and in Lexington, and if you hadn't been in the Confederate Army, your political career didn't always flourish. Tanner struggled as an attorney. He went into real estate here. Nothing seemed to work for him that well. He ended his career after the turn of in the Progressive era as a kind of a low-level bureaucrat. He collected liquor taxes for the Internal Revenue Service. One of my book reviewers asked why I hadn't used a more successful Lexingtonian than Joe Tanner. I like Joe because Joe is us. As I say in the book, I think I can quote that. In his work life, he contended in that broad and crowded space between stellar success and unmitigated failure, and that's us. Joe was us in the Gilded Age. He also was a product of the literary societies, and I thought he was interesting for that reason. He basically, even though he lived through the Progressive era into the early 1930s, he basically was a product of 19th century Lexington. That's what he remembered in his memoirs, and those are the times that he hearkened back to. The other Lexingtonian I chose was Margaret Preston. I chose her for two reasons. The first one being that she's available. And by that I mean, and this has to do with the nature of historical research. There are many interesting and cultured Lexingtonians from that time that we have no way of getting in touch with because they didn't write diaries, or if they did, they were lost or burned or gone after their lives. Their letters were destroyed and so forth. But in Margaret's case, Margaret kept elaborate, well-written diaries over a many year period of time. Her letters, which were extensive, are preserved. All of this is preserved over here in the archives here at UK, and so she was available. And the other reason that I found Margaret interesting was that she was a very influential Lexingtonian during that period of time. Margaret was well educated. She came from a very prominent family from this area. She was involved during the Progressive era. When I focus on her, she was involved in many progressive causes, from suffrage to child welfare. Margaret really cared about the intellectual life. She was extremely well read. She had been to Bryn Mawr. She, as many 19th century and early 20th century people did, she took reading very seriously. She was, as I say, she's from a wealthy family, and she was a member of the Women's Club of Central Kentucky and was chair of their Department of Literature for many years. Margaret was an interesting woman. She's been characterized elsewhere as a social butterfly. In a way she was, but she was much more than that. She, as I say in the book, Margaret and Joe represent models of the kind of intellectuality that this city could produce at that time. The student literary societies were the preeminent student groups on the college campuses in America throughout the 19th century and in a little bit into the 20th century. Surprisingly, they had vanished so completely that when I experienced undergraduate life in the 1960s, I never heard them mentioned once. But back in the 19th century, they were the big deal on campus. Here in Lexington, that was true as well. The student literary societies at State College, as the University of Kentucky was called then, met in this building, in the main building or administration building. They had their meeting rooms, or what they call their society halls. Across town at Kentucky University, or what we call Transylvania, they met in Morrison Hall, which had been there many years. They had their halls there. In fact, once in the 1800s, these guys had money, and their Brussels carpets and Chippendale chairs and things were destroyed by a tornado when it hit and tore up part of Morrison Hall. They had extensive libraries, one of which burned at one time when Morrison burned and had to be rebuilt. At any rate, they were the preeminent student groups here on both campuses in Lexington. They practiced oratory and debate in their halls or meeting rooms. But what I found to be significant was that they had many public presentations on campus. They would have events, particularly around Washington's birthday and at the end of the school year. One of the societies here was named after the first president, the Patterson Literary Society. President Patterson was a great fan of this society and was a sponsor of it. He aided them in many ways. These groups functioned not under the control of the faculty, but with their approval and support. There are still echoes of the literary societies and the student dramatic clubs in Lexington today. Certainly it's true that students have cultural and intellectual aspirations in today's world as well as they did then. Every time a student takes to the lectern and gives a speech at a UK commencement, or every time a student acts in a play here on campus, these are strong echoes of the days of the literary societies and the extracurricular dramatic clubs. What's changed is that they're part of the curriculum.